Hey everybody, thanks for tuning into the Live After GDPR podcast, where we discuss digital marketing in a post-GDPR world. In today's episode, I get to interview Paul Bannister. He's one of those real must-follow people on Twitter, where he often shares quite contrary statements, but always based upon his experience. So I was really happy that he wanted to join the show. So Paul's background is in the publisher side of things. And Paul's been working in that area for a long time, and he has a lot of experience from that side of the business. So that made it a really interesting conversation. Yeah, it's fun to hear Paul's angle on what is going on currently, what the impact of privacy regulations and privacy preserving techniques by browsers are, and how these might actually impact smaller businesses more often than the big conglomerates. So yeah, it's a really interesting episode. I really enjoyed interviewing Paul. There are some issues with the recordings on my end, unfortunately. Hopefully we can edit that all out, but especially in the video recording, you might have some blackouts sometime. Sorry for that, won't happen again. Now, hopefully you can enjoy this episode with Paul Bannister. Paul Bannister, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Rick. Great to be here.
I have been following you for a while on Twitter, and I think this is one of the reasons why, although a lot of people are hating on Twitter, I really love Twitter for finding people that you've never met and then really getting a lot of content from them. And you're one of those people. I have no clue when I started following you, but it was probably in a discussion around one of the topics that we're going to talk about today. You're very outspoken, and you usually back up your tweets with, some form of insight that always triggered me. But before we dive into those topics, could you introduce yourself to the people listening to this podcast?
Sure, absolutely. I appreciate that introduction. And I also like Twitter, and I do agree with you that I find that it's a good place to find people, and I think there's a lot of people with good insight. But to your point, you have to know who to follow. So I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of CafeMedia, and what our company does is we represent the advertising of close to 4,000 websites, typically kind of mid-size, that couldn't easily do it themselves. I mean, we'll talk about this, and I think anybody probably listening to your podcast knows, but advertising in 2022 is complicated and not obvious, and has a lot of different components to it, technical and relationship based and everything else that are challenging. And for publishers, if you're a very large publisher, sure, you're going to build your own team, you're going to build your own technology, you're going to do it yourself. But for many kind of more mid-sized publishers, it's harder and harder to do that. So we fill that gap and kind of act as their exclusive representative, and we run the ad server for them. We run all the ad exchange and ad technology partnerships. We have a direct sales team that goes out and sells on behalf of our publishers, and really, very much, we have a very strong internal culture around really focusing on helping our publishers make the most money from advertising. For many of them, it is, for their family, it is their main source of income, or for their business, it is their main revenue stream. And so therefore, it's really critical for us to make sure that they are making the most they can make. And then to flip that around, that often also means that making it so our publishers are great places for advertisers to spend their money. Obviously, advertisers only want to spend money in places that are effective, that can help them meet their goals. And so really trying to focus on making our publishers a great place for advertisers to spend their dollars. So that's a bit about us. As the Chief Strategy Officer, I work in a bunch of different areas. I also run all of our revenue teams. I run our ad sales team and our ad tech partnerships teams, and a lot of our yield optimization teams and things like that, as well as working. We have a few people now that are focused on what I'll call industry engagement and advocacy. So we are very active in the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, which is the industry body that kind of defines a lot of web standards. I'm on the board of the IAB Tech Lab, which defines a lot of the advertising industry standards and practices. Patrick McCann, who's on our team, is the chairman, or the chairman of one of the main groups of Prebid, which is the main open source organization that makes software for publishers to make money from programmatic advertising. So we've really spent a lot of time trying to be very involved in the industry and really making sure that it continues. We really believe that advertising is important to democracy. It is important to fund great content. It is important as a way for advertisers to grow their businesses, and so we really believe in that, and really are leaning into making sure that as the world changes for many reasons that are mostly good, that it continues to be a really a positive part of society, hopefully.
Yeah, gotcha. I think lots of threads we can pull on just in that statement. But how did you personally end up in the publisher side? Was it just by chance, or did that evolve over time?
I'll try to tell a long story shortly. I started a newspaper for the block I grew up on when I was 9. A friend of mine had a printer, and I made up a newspaper and we distributed it to everybody on the block. I worked on a number of different, pre-web, but digital magazines. When I was in high school, in college, I worked on one of the college newspapers, and I was one of the head people at the university TV station. Sort of random, not clearly it wasn't random. I've had a passion for bringing good information to people since I was a kid, and I really believe in it. And advertising is really one of the core revenue streams for a publisher. So I've been a believer in it for a long time.
How, in this case, let's call it privacy regulation, right? Because it's bigger than GDPR. Obviously, a lot is being modeled after the GDPR. But how is privacy regulation influencing the world of digital marketing? And most of the people listening and most of the people from my network usually work on the client side of digital marketing. So they're mostly advertisers, right? And they are experiencing a decline in the way their tools used to work, right? And you are basically on the other side of where those tools actually gather their audiences and show their impressions. So that's, I think, an interesting thing to explore. And advertising is where those two worlds meet. And it is under pressure. I think in your opening statement, you said the importance of advertising. Deeper on that, why do you think advertising is important?
If you believe that advertising is the primary revenue stream for most publishers, whether they are news or sports or lifestyle or technology or whatever they are, then if advertising is supporting the funding of that content, then that's critical for if you like to read a given technology site or whatever, you want to make sure that they're earning money for the content they're creating for you. But then when you get into journalism, again, the statement can be unpacked, and certainly there are other revenue streams, and some news organizations have done a good job diversifying. But for many, it's still the major source of revenue. And for pretty much everybody, it's still a significant source of revenue for sure. And so if you believe journalism is important to protecting democracy and well-run countries and things like that we all personally care about, then I think advertising is important for that reason. And I think that's and that's been true for, I don't know when the first newspaper ad was published, but I would bet you it was pretty close to the first newspaper being published. I think that this has been true for a long time and will be true for a long time in the future too.
If I simplify it, it funds the ability to keep people in power honest, right? It's one of the business models that does that. Yeah, exactly.
And I think also there's the grand point, which is kind of what you're saying, the real value there. But there is that small point too. For us, as a good example. Like we work with a lot of food publishers, and is getting a great recipe critical to democracy? Like maybe not, but is getting a great recipe like critical to feeding your family and making your life a little bit easier, and a core part for you? Like absolutely. And like, does that person deserve to make a living from the content that they create that readers value? Like, I think that that's true also, even if it's a little bit less grand than the journalism side of things.
That's the reason why advertising, right, has value. And obviously, it has worked for a long time. It's an exchange that people seem to agree with. But then the flip side of it, where you could argue a lot of this privacy regulation also sparked out of, is that we may have gotten a little bit overexcited with the way we started to track people and tag them. So and that sparked, of course, like it has turned advertising, the tool that was used to protect democracy, like we just discussed, into a tool that could potentially be used to harm democracy, because the data that is harvested can now be used by the NSA to, whatever kind of a story we can spin up on top of that. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a great counterpoint, or the flip side of what's happened for sure is that it can certainly be, the content itself can be bad. Obviously, there's disinformation and other bad forms of content that I would say strongly should not be able to get funding. But there is the point that the technologies that we use, primarily digital advertising, have certainly have a lot of negative or potentially negative side effects that now finally are being taken into account and consideration and being changed for. And that really is the mega trend of megatrends right now. I feel like in our industry is the move towards privacy, and how that set of changes impacts everything. You were sort of saying that before, like it's threaded through everything that we're touching, and it is the most important thing to understand deeply, I think.
If we sum it up high level, we have on web, we have, let's call it the death of cookies, right? Every browser basically, and then in the two main apps, SDKs, so on iOS and Android. Well, iOS with the app tracking transparency or transparency tracking framework has taken some really bold moves, where I think you've also had some interesting points on Twitter on that, but also Google, which is obviously themselves heavily reliant on advertising, has also taken steps on, or at least announced to take steps on the Android platform. Any other trend we're missing here, besides from obviously the legislative trend of privacy regulations?
So I think, in what you're saying, it's sort of in there, but I think it is worth saying out loud that, and this is my belief, and I think we could have a very long conversation about this, that privacy, as it has often been defined today, very much advantages very large companies. And, very specifically in that case, Google and Apple. It's no coincidence that, from Apple launching ITP in their browser, and that ATT in, the App Store world, has coincided with a massive growth in Apple's advertising revenue. And that is not a coincidence. That is completely 100% of a tied concept. So I think one very big question is how. I do really believe that there is a world we can create where privacy and competitive markets can work together and can be supportive of each other. But I think the world as it has been defined today has a little bit been too much biased towards the very large companies. The definitions of privacy that are used in different cases are advantageous to them for a variety of reasons that I think the collective, we have to figure out how to make it so. How do we get both? How do we get competitive markets, and how do we get privacy at the same time?
Well, before we search for that nuance, let's dive a little bit deeper on basically your point against Apple and Google in this case, right? So why is the way privacy is being implemented right now, let's call it, why is that benefiting the big players?
The the metaphor or whatever that I like the most is in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And I think that statement is very true here, because in a world where you talked about cookies before and first and third party cookies, and I feel like that nuance exists in the cookie world, but it exists in like the world of data in general. There is data that you as a company directly own. And even that's questionable to some level because really the user owns it. But let's say you as the company owns it, and that's your first party data. And that means that companies with the most first party data have the greatest advantage. And so for an app, I think Apple and Google you have to look at separately because of their position in the market and what their business lines are. But for Apple, a company that historically has made almost all of its money from hardware, and now we're seeing, I wouldn't say plateauing. Clearly, iPhone and iPad and Macs are selling quite well, and that's doing pretty well for them. But Apple's largest growth, the biggest growth part of the business is what they call services. And the biggest part of services is their advertising business. And so with something like ATT, where they basically say that all these apps no longer can track across all the apps, okay, that sounds like a good thing. But in that world, Apple has defined their first party as everything within their ecosystem. So they can know, I don't know every specific, but I don't even know what's to stop Apple from knowing that you listen to certain music on Spotify, because Spotify is inside the App Store. So they know you use Spotify, and they can probably figure out what songs you're listening to. And then they could recommend like, well, you should use Apple Music and we'll give you a special deal. And, don't you love your hard rock or whatever it is? Apple considers that to be their first party data. And so it's like, Spotify has been limited in terms of what it can do, which it should be. And I think that's a good thing. But Apple has not been limited. And so the access that it has to data is so much greater. So I think that, I think with Apple, like that, the problem there, I think Google, and you sort of alluded to this before, is a little bit different because Google, like all these big companies, has multiple parts to their business. So when you look at Google and you think about their search business, which is the biggest part of their business, but one of the slower growing parts, none of this matters to search at all. Like if you search for, luxury SUVs, like there's your answer. Like that's exactly what Google's showing you in the search results. They don't need any other data about you at all. Like the value is entirely in the search term. YouTube, a little bit different. Mostly, I think YouTube probably can survive on its own based on the enormous amounts of content that people consume on YouTube. They know a lot about you there. Google also, because you're logged into both Google.com and YouTube.com most of the time, can share data across those. So they know you search for luxury SUVs on Google.com. They can show you those SUV ads on YouTube.com, as well as just the contextual data from YouTube. So I think there's some value in third-party data to YouTube, but not tremendous, but some. I don't know what the number is. And then you've got Google's, network ads business, which is, what we as a company deal with, and what a lot of people think about, in terms of Google running the ad server and running the ad exchanges and running the DSPs and these different platforms that help advertisers and publishers make money on the web and in the app ecosystem. And, that part of the business, certainly is challenged by this move towards privacy. So I think Google's challenge is a little different because they're like, how do we protect search and YouTube from these changes and advantage them, but while not totally cratering this network ads business that we have that, makes a bunch of money for them. So I think they're trying to, which is obviously why they've been slower. They're trying to thread that needle of how do we do both at the same time. I think if they were forced to shut everything down, they might lose money, but I think they would lose less than most because of search and YouTube. That it doesn't really matter to them. It's one part of their business that's affected. So all of this is like, how do you think through the mechanics of these different companies and what their challenges and situation is to, in this new world that we're moving towards.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things for a company so huge as Google or Apple is that even based on their own products, their own first-party data set that people willingly opt into in exchange for using their free service, right? Whether it's Google Maps or Apple iCloud or whatever. That data set is so gigantic and it will cover so much already that their ability to model and predict based simply on that is already, nobody else can do that without a data set of the same volumes.
Yep, exactly. It's 100% agreed with you. Like, because of privacy, so much is moving from deterministic solutions where we know who some system knows who the person is. It can talk to them or measure them, to these more modeled systems. Modeled systems work better with more data, and the biggest companies have the most data, and therefore they're advantaged by that.
The added problem with this modeling is that, for instance, Google Analytics recently introduced conversion modeling for their newest version. And then on one end, it's great because it feels like you're getting some data back. But once you start diving into it, it's black box. So you're not, you can't be sure like how it's being modeled and how that's built up. So if it's about a small budget, that's fine, right? But once you start talking serious numbers, then that becomes problematic at a certain point.
One thing I saw a tweet about this over the weekend, and I'm just getting back from vacation like you, so I didn't fully process this, but somebody wrote, and this was somebody who manages Facebook ad campaigns for advertisers, and his general comment was that people who are spending thousands of dollars a day are doing okay. People who are spending hundreds of dollars a day are not doing okay. And I think a little bit that's the same point, where it's like if you're spending enough, if you're as an advertiser, if you can spend enough money to get enough data created, then Facebook and systems like Facebook can use that modeling to your advantage. But if you don't spend enough money, it's harder for the systems to work. They don't have the access to data that they need. And again, that's a tweet, so who knows exactly how true that is, but it rings true, and it feels very connected to a lot of the other points.
I want to circle back to the ATT part. So for the people who are not aware, like basically Apple set up some guidelines for apps that stipulated like data across on the back end about users. A lot of free apps, the only reason they were free was basically because they were. Could you explain that from like an ad tech point of view, how that setup used to work?
On iOS, there continues to be an ID system called IDFA, ID for advertisers. And the way that worked was that your iPhone would generate an IDFA. Let's say, Rick's is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And it would send that IDFA in all apps that the user had. So when the user requested a page or element within a given app, and there was communication back to the servers, the app on your phone would send back that I am IDFA 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And it was the same across every app. So to unfairly pick on Spotify and Candy Crush, Spotify's servers would know that Rick's iPhone was IDFA 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and Zynga, which owns Candy Crush, would also know that Rick's iPhone was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and now, those companies or partners they work with can share that information across those apps, and you could see ads in Candy Crush that were influenced by your Spotify listening history or the fact that you use Spotify or whatever it is. And again, that's with 2 apps. When you're using dozens of apps, there's a lot of data built up about you across them. And so to some level, IDFA, while different functions quite similarly to cookies, in that it allowed that kind of cross. I think we talk about like cross-site tracking and things like that, but I think like the larger term is like cross-context tracking. It allowed systems that were across places that you wouldn't necessarily expect to know that you were the same person to track you together. And Google has a similar system called Gate, or Google I forget what it stands for, but same idea that's on your Android phone.
Apple basically stated like, hey guys, this is our, and from that moment, you need this huge in your face banner, right? Where basically everybody, I think opt-out rate is probably going to be close to 100% with those banners. And then if somebody opts out, you can't circumvent that by doing shady stuff. And if we do catch you doing shady stuff, your app does not get updated or even gets thrown out of the App Store eventually, right?
Yes, although, and I'm not fully expert in the app stuff, but I follow it pretty closely. It sounds like Apple has still been pretty lax about enforcing the rules about the shady stuff. They do stop sending the IDFA if you, as a user, opt out, but there's a lot of other things that, more nefarious actors can do to track you in other ways, like your IP address and things like that. That sounds like it's still happening, and Apple has not really cracked down.
A lot of people switch to fingerprinting, but I think in the latest update by Apple, which was like, saying that you don't want people to do something, is that path.
Yeah, and this is an interesting place where where you start to see these privacy versus competition issues, where the pop-up within Candy Crush to ask the user if they consent to being tracked is can't be customized. It talks about tracking. There's no way for the owner of the app to express what any of the advantages to the user could be. And people have developed a lot of pretty good systems to try to make that opt-in rate like better than zero, to get at least some users opting in. But on the reverse side, Apple's own pop-ups for their own apps talk about personalized advertising and personalized features, and I kind of dislike the word because I feel like it's overused, but like have dark patterns in them where like the allow Apple to track button, which doesn't say that at all. It says like, personalize my experience is like highlighted, and like the don't track me is like hidden down the bottom. Like it's textbook monopoly practices, in my opinion. Like it's so easy to see how they're advantaging themselves via the interface, via the words, via everything like that.
Yeah. So and I think that's Seufert is his name, I guess. He's
RX Credit, yeah.
mobiledevmemo.com is his website, I think, and he's really on top of all of this. And there's a lot of examples where you're really scratching your head, like, okay, I get it that you want to clamp down on, on user privacy, and you want to make your ecosystem, the Apple ecosystem, privacy friendly. Like, go for it. But then you should be, you should have a level playing field where you're also respecting your own rules, so to say. And that's definitely not the case. So that, I think on that part, people will keep highlighting it, and I suspect that eventually there will be some form of a lawsuit if it's not already being started somewhere, where lawyers are going to try to get a verdict on this by judges, whether it's in the EU or in the US or probably both.
The regulator that seems to be at the forefront of pretty much all of these things, in my opinion at least, is the UK's Competition and Markets Authority, the CMA. And they came out with a big analysis. They've been working on a big analysis of the mobile app ecosystem, and the gatekeepers, as they've been called, Google and Apple. And their most recent, I think the final kind of document came out a week or two ago and talks about these kind of self-preferencing issues, and talks about different things that, it's easy to pick on Apple here, because they've done things that are pretty blatant, in my opinion. Another thing they've done is they, for a long time, really underinvested in their web browser, Safari, and specifically Safari's underlying technology is called WebKit. And on iOS devices, all browsers are forced to use WebKit. So normally Chrome and Firefox and whatever they use different engines, they're called. Chrome uses Chromium, and Firefox uses Gecko as the underlying systems. But on iOS, they're all forced to use WebKit. And Apple purposefully underinvested in WebKit, so it had less capabilities and made it so the web was a worse platform for development than the App Store. And no shock there. Apple makes a 30% cut of every app that they sell, and makes tons of money from the advertising in the app ecosystem. So of course they're going to want to make the app ecosystem better than the web ecosystem. Now it seems like they're finally trying to change that. I don't think they've caught up yet, but they're trying to fix that. But years of underinvestment give them a very big head start.
It's always hard for me to judge the WebKit developers. So I follow John Wilander, I think is like the lead developer. And I do, from what I can judge, like I don't know him personally, but from what I can judge, I think he truly cares about privacy and about the privacy features of WebKit. So I could see it that the WebKit team truly values privacy and tries to build for that. But on the other hand, on like an Apple corporate scale, they definitely know how to make and optimize making money. That's clear.
I've been on many calls with John. He is very smart and really cares and very thoughtful and very reasonable. And I've talked to a bunch of the other WebKit and Safari developers, and they're all like, the people are good people who really are trying and really are, believe and want to do the right thing. But it's not about the people really. It's about the company and the broader actions that it takes.
There's some larger incentives. So taking this back to your everyday business, how do these changes, which are what you do, so you help small to mid-sized publishers try to monetize what they do. You probably creating content in what kind of form. They're probably impacted by this, right?
They certainly could be. I think, to date, because of the way the web ecosystem works, what we've seen happen is that when Safari and Firefox made their changes to drop third-party cookies and other tracking technology over the last few years, those browsers, from a programmatic perspective, and to some level from a direct advertising perspective too, became far less effective. If you can't track the users in any way, it's really hard to measure, it's really hard to target. You lose those benefits. But what we saw happen is that while revenue from those browsers and CPMs and other metrics like that went down significantly, the money mostly moved to Chrome. So the pie didn't really shrink. It just redistributed where the money was. So that was annoying, but not catastrophic by any stretch. Whereas, when Chrome, who is now, in this kind of final process of removing third-party cookies and replacing them with these new technologies they call the privacy sandbox, with that happening probably next year sometime, that's a little bit of a different change, because when that change happens, there's nowhere, unless the collective we in this industry create new technologies and solutions, there's nowhere for the money to redistribute to. If you do nothing, advertisers will just spend less money because it'll be less effective. And that's bad for advertisers and bad for publishers.
So what you're saying is we had a hypothetical publisher, and they made $1 million, and that was spread across all browsers on web. And what you saw that advertising budget move basically almost all to Chrome. To me, this is always puzzling, because the fact, right? If there are actual people using those other browsers, just as effective on the bottom line, right? It's just that you're not able to measure it. You're not able to measure the clicks, and this is not able to stitch them together, right, to a user. What are your thoughts on this? Because this has always baffled me. I get it, but business-wise, it doesn't make sense, because there are still people using Safari and Firefox. It's still people who actually purchase stuff.
Demographically, and I'm sure you know this, iPhone users are more affluent and spend more money than Android users. So of course you want to reach those users, and you hit the nail on the head with measurement. That's the killer. If you're, and you deal with marketers all the time, if you're spending $1 million, and that if I spend it this way, I can measure exactly how that $1 million is being delivered, and what the returns are, and what my return on ad spend is, and all those things that you really care about. And if I spend $1 million over here and I get none of that data, why would I spend $1 there? When you think about it philosophically, of course you want to advertise to iPhone users, but in reality, if you can't measure that, it's really hard for you to do. And there's also all these like, other sort of like misaligned incentives in the industry where, buying platforms like DSPs they're incented to spend your money. So, and if they're incented to spend your money, they're going to spend it in ways where they can justify that money, which is going to be tools that you can measure. I think if you went to a lot of marketers and said, do you know you're not actually reaching any users on iPhones, they would probably be shocked by that fact. I don't think that they really registers to people because you don't see that unless you like dig into the reporting. You just see that I spent $1 million and I made $2 million and I won. You don't know that you actually missed out on a bunch of people that you didn't even reach at all.
This is really fascinating because I think it's actually a huge business opportunity if you can. I think the issue is twofold. So one is people want to have the feeling of control, right? So they want that measurement piece, and we have become it's what I do. But then the interesting one as well. I was once at a Google conference, and there I got to talk with some big players on the DoubleClick side, and then I heard some numbers, and I heard how the incentives work, and that really blew my mind because it immediately made some things clear about why certain things are the way they are. Could you walk the listeners through like how the setup works with like you have the DSP, the SSP, and what are the parties in between like an ad being served and an ad being clicked, and how the money flows?
There's lots of nuances beyond this, but you sort of hit like the core flow of how money flows and how things work. Advertisers typically use platforms called DSPs, demand side platforms, to and this is to buy ads on the web or in the app ecosystem or in YouTube or on Google search or whatever. Facebook has their own system, and they might not all be called DSPs, but there's some web interface you log into or app interface that you log into where you can say, I'm spending this much money, I want to reach these kind of users, I'm going to run from this date to this date. Here's what my ad creative looks like. It's your system for setting up and managing your ad campaign. So on the advertiser side, you've got DSPs. Publishers set up their sites and sort of like market their sites in systems called SSP, supply side platforms, and those let you as a publisher package up your inventory and say, this is my sports section, and this is my cooking section, and this is my news section, and break things down that way. They allow you to attach, when as a publisher you have user data, like that information can be sent in through there. They allow you they do yield optimization to help you maximize the return on every impression. And then those SSPs also ultimately conduct the auction. So what happens? So if you've got publishers connect to SSPs, SSPs connect to DSPs, and DSPs connect to advertisers, like that's your flow. And then when you think about like, okay, like how does the ad actually get delivered? A user goes to a website, and let's, for sake of simplicity, say this website has one ad on it. That the SSP sees that one ad, and it sends out a signal to a bunch of DSPs and says, hey, I've got an ad for sale. It's on this site. Here's the IP address of the user. Here's the page that the user's on. Here's some other information that I have. Hey, you DSPs, because advertisers work with many different DSPs, so the SSPs have to connect to dozens of DSPs. Who wants to bid? The DSPs go into their systems and say, okay, for this site, for this user, for this time of day, for this ... whatever, what ads do I have that are relevant? The DSP itself figures out then, okay, what's my best bid, and sends that to the SSP. The SSP receives now bids from all these different DSPs, and it conducts an auction and says which one is, usually the highest price wins, but there could be some reasons why sometimes you might want to throw out the highest price for some reason or whatever. It conducts that auction, and then based on the winner of that auction, the ad creative displays on that site, and that's sort of the way it all flows through. And to your point of incentives, pretty much everybody's incented to get the dollar spent, except really for the marketer. So the marketer's like, kind of guarantee but historically has been measurement. If I know my dollars are being spent in ways that I'm making more money, okay, I want to do that. But if I don't know, or if I'm not making more money, I don't want to do that. So everybody is incented to make the system say that you are making more money. And that's why measurement, I think, matters so much.
That's also, I guess, why the switch from deterministic to probabilistic, it can be very dangerous. Like, because usually the companies who are doing money from the advertiser.
Yep, 100%.
I remember, I think it's already a couple of years ago now, that I think it was Procter and Gamble. Yeah, I think we don't trust the transparency of this chain that you just described, and we think that there's first of all too much money that's being kept in each of those ad tags in between, and we highly doubt the validity of impressions and stuff like that. And then they decided to do a big budget cut. I don't know if they came back from that. Do you know that?
Procter & Gamble still spends a lot of money. They might have said something like that. I know a bunch of other advertisers did say and measure similar things. I think it was Chase Bank was one. And this is a little bit of a different point, but one thing they were doing, I think they realized they were spending money on, like, I forget the number, but it was like 120,000 websites. They were like, what the heck what even are these websites? Like, where the heck am I? Like, it doesn't make any sense. And they cut their ad spend from, I'm making up the number, 100,000 websites to like 4,000 websites. And they lost no scale. They lost everything measured just as well as it was before. And they were like, and now we can actually look at this list and be like, okay, I can actually start wrapping my head around this list of websites. So I do think that it's really important for advertisers to be thoughtful about like how they're spending the money, where they're spending the money, understanding those incentives of other companies to spend their money for them, and really be thoughtful about, where are you spending your money and how is that being measured and who are you actually reaching, and like asking those hard questions, I think, is really important.
And just having this talk with you and discussing this this issue of the budget moving all to Chrome when the other browsers were not measuring anymore. One thing that on their bottom line when doing those incrementality tests, right? So just try to only spend on Safari for a month and not spend on the other browsers for a month, and don't try to measure the steps in between. Have faith in your funnel that it's still. I think that's actually if you dare to go against the common wisdom of everything needs to be measured, and you kind of go against the stream on that, you might actually be able to find some underpriced ad inventory if others are running away from it.
I totally agree with you, and I totally agree that incrementality is the way to look at this, because it's funny, and this is a place where I think publishers and advertisers really have shared interests and share the right ways to do things. I think the shared interest is, and I sort of said this at the beginning, like, as a publisher, I want to make sure that the advertising on my sites is effective, because if it's effective, then you as the advertiser want to spend more. So that's a win for both of us. And I think on the reverse side, like you talk about incrementality, we spend tons of time measuring incrementality from the publisher perspective, because it's so easy to, if you're making $1 million and you bring on a new ad tech partner, and that ad tech partner makes you $50,000, you're like, ooh, that's $50,000. Like, that's good. That's more money. And it's like, but in reality, it's not true. Most of the time, that's just money redistributed from elsewhere. So you might, maybe you're making $1,005,000 now. And so like the incrementality is far lower than you would believe if you just look at like the base numbers of where my money is coming from. So I think incrementality is so critical to measure for advertisers and publishers.
On the publisher side, is that what you would call yield optimization? Like that you would do that with incrementality?
Yeah, exactly. The technology and tools are slightly different. Like, we measure incrementality by, we call it holdout. We hold out ad tech partners some percent of the time. So we know when they're not there, here's how much less we make. and we, it's a small percentage. You can figure it out, but it becomes, once you've got the system set up, relatively easy to know this partner's making us a ton of incremental money, and this partner's actually negative. When we run them, for some reason, we actually make less money than we would, and we're going to shut them off immediately. So it's definitely the best way to look at things.
Yeah, super interesting. Never thought about it from the publisher side of things. Do you also do those kind of tests across multiple publishers? So you test an ad tech vendor across multiple publishers and then per publisher? Because I could imagine like it could be that one ad tech partner really works well for this specific publisher or a niche or...
Exactly. Yeah, we definitely do all those things. And you can, and just like on the advertiser side, you can really get into the weeds and see like this partner like actually doesn't do well between midnight and 5 a.m. Turn them off for those hours. Like there's all kinds of nuance about like the way it works and the special solutions that each company has that you want to measure all those different cuts to understand it. And I think again, same is true for the advertiser side too.
Let's call it pre-GDPR, pre-cookie banners, and everybody was moving towards the tool will fix everything for me world, right? So we were in a implement for clients was baffling, and now because of both legal reasons, right? Because every script, but also because of most of the scripts don't even work anymore because ITP, ATT, whatever is limiting them. Mentality testing, you can build a framework for it, but in the end, you're still going to have to figure it out a bit. You have people working on it, trying to make sense of what's going on. Do you think that's a fair statement?
We definitely see similar things, and we deal with similar things because of GDPR and other privacy regulations. And the legal point you brought up is interesting. Like there's a study from some academic researchers that I thought was pretty interesting that showed, and you probably saw this, that after GDPR, not only did the number of scripts and partners that different companies had go down, because now you've got legal risk, you've got legal review that's higher and things like that, and that's certainly true. But the companies that were the partners that were most affected were smaller. I think that's probably true too, because if you're as a publisher or an advertiser looking for who your partners are going to be, you're certainly going to partner with Google. You're certainly going to partner with Facebook. You're certainly going to partner with a few of these, like maybe Adobe or some other like sets of giant companies. But some third party that's smaller that might have some really great innovative solution, you're probably going to say no to because you can't deal with the legal review, you can't deal with the legal risk, and like is that the study didn't get into does this really reduce innovation, but it did certainly say that smaller companies are more negatively impacted because the users of the technology are just less likely to approve those things to run, which I think is its own interesting side effect here.
Yeah, definitely. If you have to run through the whole, it's really. I'm still on the fence on these things because on one end, I love the way that we were just experimenting with. Oh yeah, there's a new tool. Let's throw it on. Let's see what it does. Right. I love that way of doing things, and I learned a lot. But to be fair, there's probably a lot of tools that I've used in the past and that we tested on websites that may have been hacked without us knowing it on the back end, or a leaked data or what, right? So there's a lot of carelessness in our enthusiasm, might be the best. So, and I think that's where these regulations come in and play a role. But it's the point of innovation is, yeah, it's really valuable, right? Because innovation, you have to jump through X amount of hoops. It's a hard problem. Like
that's the killer, is there isn't really a simple answer. Because I do think the other question that we haven't asked, that again could be its own long conversation, is it's a bit of an unfair question because I think to some level the answer is positive, but is users' privacy better now, 4 years into GDPR and several years into CCPA in California and years into other ones? Is users' privacy better now than it was or would have been without those things? And I think the answer is yes, but like how much? And really where? And like what is better? And like and what has changed because of that? Like there's also this point that like no one's really focusing on, like I think, we all raise our hand and say more privacy is better. Like, I think we all agree with that statement. But, do these regulations, are they getting us to that place in the right way? And I think those questions aren't being asked or answered, and they're hard questions. They're not easy questions to answer. And I don't know. Aside from like a simple yes, like I don't know how much. I think on the flip side, no one would say like the GDPR is the best regulation in the history of regulations. People are like, it's complicated, it's confusing, it doesn't make sense. Cookie banners are terrible. Like it had all these unintended consequences. Like I think people would say those things too. So it's like, are there better ways to get to the point we want to get to? And again, it's a really hard conversation, but I think those are important things to dig through.
For me, the more I talk to people from all sides of the spectrum, the more I think it's about, because it's so big and how we how we would proceed as a world. So it's one of the most important things we have, and that's why it can be figured out and then released. Like it's not like going to be a version 1. The GDPR is like a counter move for all those years of everybody just freewheeling on the internet and just inventing and throwing stuff out there. And now it's a pendulum swinging, and now it's probably overcorrecting perhaps a bit. Like I think it's definitely limiting innovation compared to how fast innovation in those kind of spaces went before. But it is making people think about building tools with a privacy by design mindset, right? Because if I would fund a startup now, and that startup did not have like a way to build their data infrastructure in a way that isolates data sets basically to make them not liable to huge lawsuits. And so that's probably happening already, because I'm not an investor, and I'm definitely not at the front of all that, but those people are probably way smarter and have been thinking about this. So that's likely an outcome. So it will take a couple of years for us to see that in the marketplace, of course.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also think, I haven't fully read through it, but the proposed U.S. federal privacy legislation that got released a few weeks ago has a few interesting things in it that I think, and I'm not making a comment on the broader legislation in general, but I like the point that it thinks about some kinds of data as more needing to be more private and more secure than other forms of data. And I think when you're talking about location data or healthcare data or financial data and things like that, like that is more important and can be misused in far worse ways. Whereas the silly example I used before, like if you're in the market for a luxury SUV, like you might actually want companies to know about that, because like you don't actually know what all your choices are, and you want to get what the right ads are, and like it doesn't matter as much. Like that information is not as important as like the fact that you have diabetes, or you were in this location at this time, and things like that that are really should be very private and very secure.
Yeah, I think the main thought on the GDPR has these special classifications of data, right? That about health and those kind of topics. But I think the GDPR takes this point of view of it's better to prevent it from happening, right? So it's better to, I think the issue with all those data sets, once they are able to link them, then suddenly the picture becomes really detailed about a person. And I think that's the main, this from your point of view in your daily business. So you help publishers with ad tech, right? So you are in that picture that we just sketched out with the DSPs and the SSPs, and you are also dealing with making sure that those ads are as relevant as possible. So what are the steps you are taking, like from a privacy perspective, on the technology side?
I think for us, step one with privacy is We talk about the sword and the shield is sort of our conceptual framework. And so the first part is the shield. How do you make sure that the way you operate is adhering to privacy regulations and privacy expectations and things like that? Like, how do you just do the defensive things to make sure you're not breaking any rules or you're not doing things in a way that users, wouldn't understand or whatever? So I think, so part one is the shield. Like, how do you just defensive around this? And I think, and then the second part is the sword. How can you use changes in the world around privacy to your advantage from a business perspective? And again, within, with the shield always being first, you've got to do things the right way. But to your point about innovation, like if companies are innovating around creating new technologies that are really privacy respecting, those companies, and it will take time, but those companies will win in theory over time. I think the same is true for a company like ours, where it's like, how do we stay ahead of those privacy things and do forward-thinking things? And it's one of the reasons, I mentioned at the beginning, we're active in the W3C and in Prebid and the IB and these other trade bodies, because we want to be part of helping define what the standards are going to be, because that, one, makes sure that we can defend the way our publisher, the way our publishers make money and the way our part of the world works. But second, by being at the front of the line, we know more about those technologies than other people. We understand how to use them better. We're the first in line to implement them and things like that. And that's, I think, where the sword comes into play, is like really being, front of the line and knowing what's happening better than most. So for us, like that's kind of how we think about it.
Like in practice, since 2018, have you had to redesign like how basically how your systems work, or is it alterations, or how does this look from a technical point of view?
You've got like the cookie banner part of the world, which there, like, we basically just follow, in the advertising industry, the IAB defines the standards about how websites and apps and things collect data and collect consent and distribute the consent information and whatever. And we follow those practices. And as those practices have evolved and been updated, we just continue to, again, like, stay at the front and keep making sure we're doing things the right way. So that's what we do on that side. I think internally, we spent a lot of time thinking about and continue to think about, when, and you being based in Europe probably know this even more, think about this more than we do, but like it permeates a little bit of like everything you do, where even now our database team has to think about like, oh, we're moving data from here to here. And if that data has no PII and has no user data, like do whatever you need to do. But if that data does have PII or user data in it, now we've got to document this better. Now we got to keep track of this. Now we got to understand what these processes are, who has access to these controls. Like there's a different and more structured process that you go through to make sure that you're keeping track of those things and using them the right way. And so it has like, it permeates your organization and the way you think about things and the way you do things, because you have to be more cautious and careful and thoughtful about what you're doing there to stay on the right side of the regulations.
One thing that I'm always curious about, I have a couple of publisher clients as well. So then I get to work with those ad scripts. In a lot of cases, it's Google's DFP. What always puzzles me is the way of loading, right? Because let's assume it's a European website, right? So strict GDPR implementation, GDPR cookie banner. So I arrive on a website first visit. So I am unknown. I get the cookie banner pop up. At that moment, is the DFP loaded or not? Before I click the pop up, right? So I have not interacted with it.
Those are good questions. I remember being parts of these conversations. I can't remember what we do and what we recommend others do. I do think that, to make a dumb statement, like GDPR doesn't mean you can't call other partners It just means you need to call them appropriately and instruct them what they can do with any data that they get themselves. So in your case, if you're calling DFP or GAM, as it's called now, before you have consent, that isn't necessarily wrong as long as you are telling Google, I don't have consent yet for you, and therefore you can't process this in certain ways, and you can't use this in certain ways. So I think to some level, it's partially about the order, but also partially about how you're communicating consent or lack of consent at those times.
Exactly, because I remember that DFP or DAM, like you said, has had the option of showing non-personalized banners. So, basically the lowest yielding stuff you can get, I guess, right? And I think that's the topic of the website. And then after consent, we could update the signal, and then Google could go all out with all the interesting stuff they knew about the user and everything else we sent to them. To me, it's still it seems like such a, because once you go into that, you opting out becomes really hard, right? Because once you start to share, you have under the GDPR you have to give the opt-out option. But to me, that always feels like, okay, I can't verify that information that you just shared before that will actually be removed, because once you send it you're going to send it to one DFP, but it's going to spread it out across the gazillion of ad networks that are integrated in that, right? And if you open the network tab, you see them all load if you're lucky. And to me, that concept, it feels like that is broken, like going forward.
Do you know about GPC, Global Privacy Control?
That's the huge opt-in, opt-out list that you can get in the IAB.
No, that's the GVL. That's the global vendor list. GPC is I don't know if you call it a standard, but it's like a little industry group that popped up in the US at first to deal with CCPA. But what it is it's a signal that you as a user can like flag on yourself. It's not about a website, it's about you. And so the easy way to think about GPC is it's a browser plugin that you can put on Chrome or any browser.
It's like the do not track signal.
It's like the do not track signal, but it in theory will work better than the do not track signal, because for a number of reasons that people who are smarter than I about privacy have thought about a lot. Because what it does is when you turn on GPC for yourself, you as the user in that browser at least are always kind of emanating the fact that you are GPC enabled. And what that means is that even if 1,000 companies or 10,000 companies, whatever, have your data, if that GPC signal is attached to it, that company has to abide by that signal. And if they don't, they are liable for that. And so it removes the onus from the user and the site on that page for keeping track of stuff, and it kind of addresses your problem where like data that previously about me I did consent to, but now I've removed consent for, that old data still floating around. GPC, like, because it's about you, like that old data in theory, as long as it's attached to you, which is where the problem comes from anyway, and you're GPC enabled, then those companies need to know that they can't use that data in the wrong way. And GPC is great because it's so simple. It doesn't quite fit with GDPR because GDPR has more complex consent requirements and things than CCPA does. But there may be a way to make it work, because it is about, it's really funny. In order to prevent tracking,
you have to track. Yeah.
You actually need to track the user, which is kind of this funny. If you can't track the user, you actually lose consent and you lose those capabilities. And so it's this very weird catch-22. And GPC is like a pretty elegant way to try to get around some of those problems.
Every time I try to do these mental be solved easily without giving up a lot of data, you always end up with the fact like, yeah, if you want a signal to delete it, then by definition, you have to tell them who you are, because otherwise they can't delete it, right? And that's like it's hard.
Right. We had this funny conversation about deletion requests and access to information requests and whatever, that, different names under GDPR and CCPA and other regulations. And if somebody requests that their data, that they don't want to be tracked and that they want their data deleted, we can do all of those things for them. But we actually have to keep the fact that they sent in a DSR. Like, we can't delete that data, because if we delete that data, then we might accidentally recapture their data later. And so it's this very weird, and some of those things were forethought, and people figure those out. But it puts you in these funny situations where you're like, how do we do this the right way without breaking the law, but also like meeting the user expectation correctly, which aren't exactly in sync.
Yeah, the first episode of the podcast, I talked to Aurélie Pols, who's a DPO for mParticle, among other things. And yeah, she really has a great understanding of this legal framework and how complex the role of the DPO is in order to do the thing that you just described. I think currently the only right, so you have the technical part and then you have the legal stuff to cover that. But I personally, I would love to be able to do it just with technology and make the legal part obsolete, right? If we can figure out some way to get it to a construction where you could say like, hey, we had your data, but we deleted the keys and then we deleted the data set, and you can verify that here. That would be the perfect solution, right? If we could figure something out where it's actually impossible to change it after the fact. But maybe that's the real use case of crypto after all.
or maybe not. But I agree that's an important question to answer.
For you, if you are thinking about both the future, personally. For your company, like what are the things that you're really worried about or excited about? What do you see for the next couple of months in the space that you're watching?
We focus on the web primarily, and because of the Chrome changes coming, I think like that is the overriding focus for the next batch of time. We're doing a lot of work beta testing a lot of these solutions. We're in the origin trials of Chrome's privacy sandbox and testing those things out. And it really is about getting ready for those things, with the caveat to everything that it's always hard to, if we're going to deploy engineering resources as an easy, case, it's always easier to deploy them against things that we can do that will make us $1 more tomorrow. These things are things that might make us $1 more a year and a half from now. And so sometimes they're hard to prioritize. So, but we're figuring out the right balance. We're actually in the process of hiring a dedicated team to work on these future-oriented things, because when they're prioritized against tomorrow's problems usually win. And when they're next year's problems can be punched down the road a little bit. So it really is about prioritizing these new technologies, these new solutions. Of which we talked about the Chrome privacy sandbox a little bit, but there's dozens of other technologies and solutions being tested and tried, and some are quite good and some are not very good, and some will last. Some I think will stand the test of time, and others I think might be dead in 2 years for other reasons. So I think it is about trying these things out, and the other metaphor we've been using a lot is, and this was kind of a paraphrase of something a major advertiser said to me, which I liked a lot. She said, there's no silver bullet to these problems. It's a patchwork quilt of solutions. And I think that's the truth. I think in the old world, third-party cookies and IDFAs sort of made everything work. And now with those things gone or dying, it is about this new patchwork quilt of solutions, because there won't be a one-size-fits-all answer anymore. And the benefit is, I think for most marketers and most publishers, you don't need to worry about all of them. There's too many, they're too complicated, they're very technical. You don't need to know the details, but you need to make sure that your technology partners are really thinking about those things and are really ahead of those things and are picking good solutions and are not. I do think the danger of thinking there's a silver bullet is bad. You need to be investing in multiple directions. And again, I think as a marketer, it's critical to be pushing your partners in many directions. If the company you work with most is focused on a single solution, like that almost definitely is not the answer.
Silver bullet solutionism is always dangerous in technology.
Exactly.
And I think for marketers on the client side, I think what I notice on the advertising side, they're getting pushed a lot by Google and Facebook to spend more, pushed. But ever since the ability to measure dropped, it has become worse, and the pressure is on, and also the way to regain what was lost in measurement, they're both trying to pull it towards them. So finding a view and advise you on that is probably worth it, at least to get some intel.
Totally agree. I think it's hugely important to find trusted partners, and there aren't that many out there, but they exist.
Great. Paul, thanks a lot for talking with me. I learned a lot. Maybe in the future, after Google releases their Chrome upgrade of publishing looks from your end.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks for having me. It was a great conversation.
On Twitter for sure. I'm not sure if you're also active on other platforms.
Follow me on Twitter. Bannister, PBANNIST is my Twitter handle. Feel free to connect on LinkedIn. I don't use LinkedIn as much, but happy to connect with people, and happy to talk and answer questions, and always want to talk to people who care about content and advertising, and I think it's critical, and always like to talk to like-minded people.
Yeah, I can highly recommend your Twitter feed. Learned a lot from it over the last couple of months. Thanks for being on, and we'll talk soon.